All right. So I just want to get situated. But I'm so glad to be here with you tonight because what you guys don't know is I really consider David to be one of my closest friends, and I'm really honored to celebrate your book with you. Because we can get to book one, getting to book two, three, and plus is hard. But also, um, I like that I get the chance to tell you that before I had a PhD, you were one of the people who made me believe that I could do this just by being you. So thank you for that.
Well, no, appreciate it.
Because you don't get to. You think a PhD is going to be somebody with the patches on the blazer
All the
and all of
time.
that,
All the
or
time.
they're talking about poetry under the tree on campus, and then you meet somebody like David, and you're like, oh, you look like bruh from Runaway, you know. So for me, that was really powerful to see that early in my writing career. So thank you, David.
No, thank you. And thank you for encouraging me by being so productive despite whatever situations were going on and always seeing you
Right.
do that. Because that's hard to do in terms of, life starts lifing, but
Mm-hmm.
sometimes our writing is our credence, right? It's our pathway.
Right.
But to see you continue that path was always inspiration to me. Like when we talk about, I feel like talking to you is like talking to the DJ who's always breaking records and
Oh
saying
man.
to the audience, like, get up on this, right? And then so I always think about that in terms of our exchanges.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. But I think one of the things I love about this book is it is very rigorous in terms of the scholarship and looking at some of the studies and the people who are looking at housing, policing, education. What does it mean when we have these school closures for the people who inhabit those schools and all of that and how that's affecting our neighborhoods? But there's really a lot of you in this book too. And I think that positionality is important there as well, right? To be like, I grew up here. I know people who grew up here. I've lost people here. And I love this city. And I just figured maybe you might want to share a little bit to start us off, like in the beginning of the book.
Yeah, and this is always a question, like, as a Chicagoan, how do you tell a Chicago story
Mm,
being very explicit? And in the book, I talk about this kind of unusual relationship, right? It's a place that I love, but also a place that I've experienced certain levels of trauma.
right.
And so now when you think about what that means in real time, the Chicago space now allows you to talk about memory. And the forward is written by one of the homies, David Phillipson,
Right.
who's from Oakland. And he talks about, I remember I was in a talk that he was in, and he said, I feel as if I am losing, that people talk about Oakland as losing memory. And then he says,
Mm,
when I reflect, I realize that the memory being lost is my own.
yeah.
So that's always the thing in Chicago. Like, so, being in your 50s from a place, you go into spaces, and I always crack. I have a uncle who just turned 89 yesterday,
Hmm.
and he and I cracked this joke. I was like, Unc, if you came here, some of the spaces that you were familiar with not only no longer exist, but if I dropped you in that space, you wouldn't know where you were.
Yeah.
So that to me is always that piece around how do you tell that story, but also not being a story of despair, but also saying there are people who recognize this, but who are also refusing it, right?
Right.
Refusing to be moved, refusing to be uh, explicated, refusing to be passed on, gentrified, or what have you. So it was
Exactly.
really around because you can write the Chicago despair story, right? Very quickly. But it's another thing to say, no, there has to be something else there. And that to me was the the black the black fugitive futures, but also abolition in saying we understand abolition as constructive and not destructive,
Right.
right? So if something does not deserve to exist, then what are you willing to build? So
Right.
that was the story I was trying to communicate, but it became difficult because you have to tell those kind of nooks and crannies and get into those spaces. And then you gotta, as writers, you gotta stop and just go, shit. All right,
Right.
let me sit down for a second and then go back to it.
But it makes me think a lot about too, like everyone, well, I won't say everyone. I think some people are really surprised at how much Black people are getting into science fiction and speculative fiction now. And I think that's really the crux of why they're doing that. They're doing that because we need to imagine new things. We need to imagine things in order to build them. And I was loving that part when you and Damon Williams started talking about that with the work that he was doing with Let Us Breathe with his sister Christiana. I was like, yeah, that's what we're doing. It's like, it doesn't just stop there, where you read a story. It's us imagining the potential, whether it be good or bad. I mean, even now when I talk to students, I'm talking about iRobot. Because I'm like, if you don't know what iRobot is really about, let's think about AI a little differently. But it also brings me back to the point, there's one point directly in the book, you just say language is important. And I love that there are so many things like just now that you rename in the book to reflect what they actually mean. Like, I remember one of the things that stood out to me about the Chicago Magazine article was they were really fixated on this idea of engineered conflict, right? And talking about it in a way as if, well, what is, it felt a little bit like Clutch the Pearls hubbub moment where they're like, would you really call it that? And I'm like, yeah. When you think about the intentionality of public policy, what else would it be? Right? And I would love for you to talk a little bit about some of the other terms you do that with in the book too.
So, and again, I want to shout out the young homie, Dr. Catherine S. Cho, who put me up on the concept because I was at UCLA in something called the Research Apprenticeship Collective.
Right.
And I was out, this is early stages of kind of thinking about the book. And I just said, well, can a city make you fight?
Yeah.
Right. So this thing around just thinking about it very explicitly. Right. And now, if a city can make you fight, what are the means that it activates to make you fight? So now, and then Catherine said, well, look, in engineering, we always talk about engineering is the elimination of human error.
Right.
So now if we think about a city engineering a fight or starting a fight, what's the purpose? Like, to what end?
Right.
And I think another thing that I thought was important to talk about was structural violence, right? Because we often think about violence as solely interpersonal, right? We only think about it as someone who has been harmed, someone who is doing the harm, but we rarely think about it in terms of cities. And it made me think about news reports. So when we turn on the news and they talk about a shooting, such and such and such and such, they'll never say this was the result of disinvestment, misappropriation, and 80 years of segregation, right? Yeah. It's always the quick hit, right? So that thing around, so I wanted to have that conversation around structural violence. I also wanted to have that conversation around uneven development.
Right.
Because this is now when you see it, I mean, Chicago has these wild kind of spaces. So many of my colleagues who are here from UIC,
right.
We see these buildings go up and these ugly monstrosities, right? But at the same time, you look at the opulence of them, right? So there's a building right around the corner from campus that has a private elevator. Right, so it's like you on power, right? So
oh my God,
like you hop in the elevator, like you get up, you go up 2 floors, you in the house. I'm like, damn, wow. So you think about that and you say, well, look, here's a space where you got a private elevator, a 2-bedroom starts at $1.3 million, right? And literally 6 miles away, you got somebody who is wondering whether or not they will make it to the next day.
Right.
Right. So when you think about that type of disparity, I thought it was important to say, let's not beat around the bush here. Let's go into these words and say, if this is happening, then how are people experiencing this, right? And more
Right.
importantly, what are we seeing and what is the rhetoric of development, right?
Yeah.
In terms of how people are talking, because it's always this thing around quote unquote improvement. The question I wanted to put up was improvement for whom and under what conditions?
Right.
And I think those were the spaces. And I borrow that, from folks like one of your homies, Togo Easton Martin, who
Yeah.
talks about that and says, well, look, you start fighting yourself before you start fighting the system that oppresses you.
Right.
So this thing around really putting that in a different conversation, and I felt like those words, teasing them out, would allow readers to say, oh, this is what this is, and here's some reasons why we don't talk about
Right. And then too, I love that you quote Tongo in the book, and he's really in the through line
it.
because not just, well, I always tell Tongo, I'm like, dude, you're Bob Kaufman's son. So if you haven't read Bob Kaufman's poetry, I highly recommend it. But not just because of the stylistic parallels that they have, um, but because they don't talk about him as much. And I think it's not just because he's black.
Mhm.
I think it's also because he was about that same thread of political resistance in the writing, right? He was quite, he didn't even speak for like a decade because of the Vietnam War.
Mhm.
He was constantly harassed and brutalized by the police in the Bay Area. So whenever I hear Tongo read, I'm like, I hear it,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
even though it's like, it's just that same kind of thing where it's a cascade of images
Mhm.
hitting you. And it's definitely in that piece, which has a lot of parallels. I love that you come back. Well, you reference hip hop in the book because that's inescapable.
Mhm.
But the thing that's resilient for me as a reader was seeing the quote from I Am God at the end of the book,
Mhm.
which I wasn't familiar with them. So
Yeah.
sometimes, I'm not listening to everything new. I got to go back and Google it.
Right.
So I went back and I listened to it and I'm like, yeah, the analysis is almost parallel to everything you say in the book and talking about that level of harm. And it definitely made me think too, because there's a point in the book where you talk about people making these policies for public safety. But you're really asking, it's like, okay, so what about the public safety of marginalized people? Don't they matter?
Mhm.
How can you make them matter? Right. And I guess I'm just wondering, how do you feel like we can start to approach that?
Yeah, I always think about folks who do like critical criminology, restorative justice, abolition studies in education, abolition studies
Hmm.
in the carceral state, who often talk about, and actually practitioners who say,
Hmm.
look, you won't ever arrest your way out of a violence problem, right? We just have no proof
Hmm.
in the 80 years of data being collected that you will arrest your way out of a problem,
No.
right? So now, who are we in relationship with, right?
Hmm.
And now, when we ask that question, where who are we in relationship with, now the work instantly shifts
Right.
because now you're asking the question of how am I actually engaging with folks who actually have more of the solution than the problem.
Hmm.
And now when people get into the tough on crime rhetoric, it's like we know that that's never worked, right?
Hmm.
And the things that do work actually run counter
Hmm.
to what we actually know to be real with folks. So like I always think about it, and I didn't put this in the book, but I always think about, I was trying to figure out, sometimes you had these things that you try to fit in the book,
Hmm.
but I was thinking about Tom Dart. And Tom Dart is the sheriff of Cook County.
Right.
Tom Dart, for the last 15 years, has always said, I run the largest mental health institution in the world,
Hmm.
Cook County Jail,
Yeah.
right? So, this thing around, here's someone who's a quote unquote tough on crime dude who understands this,
Hmm.
right? That we're not talking about solving anything or preventing or reducing
Hmm.
until we actually get to those particular issues and concerns. And
Hmm.
how do we, and then the other part of that is, how do we spot those concerns without becoming paranoid?
Yeah.
Because that's often the thing when it's something that we see. Now we want to jump instantaneously and just try to arrest it, try to contain it, try to push it away,
Right.
in opposed to saying, well, wait, if we thought about responsible development, and it goes back, in the beginning of the book, talking to one of my guys who was on a gang tactical unit,
All right.
and his boss, he put me on three-way. Chicago, you always got a homie. He was like, look, let me put you on three-way real quick. He was like,
There is definitely the three-way.
right. He was like, hold on, let me put you on three-way real quick. And I remember I was at Penn State,
All right.
and I'm in a hotel room, and I'm on the phone. I'm like, man, his old commanding officer was like, Stovall, he said, I heard about you. Then I'm like, oh shit. And then he said, look, man, I actually agree with you. And he said, here's something that we've known as police departments.
Okay.
He said, we know that no young person born on this planet is born with an inherent propensity to violence or crime. What we do know is that certain areas see these increases, but they have also been disinvested.
Right.
So now all you have to do is create a space where there's very little resources. And then how he put it to me, he said, and then you hire me to contain those people.
Right.
So now the frustration just builds up. And when we don't think about, and indigenous folks always talk about this, who are we in right relationship with?
Yes.
Right? And who are our relations? And now, if you don't have that, you don't have a chance to quote unquote reduce violence.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we have to think about what is the relational work that you have to do.
Right.
And then what can you put in the place of, in the way of a non-reformist reform like no cash bail,
right,
to get folks in those spaces that allow us to say, well, there's a relationship here, and now how are we either supporting a relationship or are we deepening the isolation?
Right.
And I think that's always the struggle. And I remember here in Chicago years ago, and this is when the homicide rates were kind of kicking up really high. And there was an indigenous woman who came here as part of this larger collective. And she was looking at the homicide rates, and she said, I wonder who are they in relationship with? And I mean, like, just the way she said it, I was just like, damn, no one gets to that particular question. Like, no one dares to ask it.
They don't.
Because she was saying, like, look, if you had a conversation around who you are in relationship with, then how you interact with folks will be different. Like, always,
you're investing in it in a different way.
Exactly. So like in Oakland, the story always would just like, it made the most sense. And I've been talking about it for the last 20 years. So, you got all this kind of fighting in schools. So the principal just says, all right, we're going to stop using resource officers. We're going to replace every resource officer with a grandmother from the community.
Yeah.
Right? And then all of your fights, they just go through the floor. And they start asking the young folks, like, what's happening? And young folks was like, shit, man, I ain't trying to be out here fighting in front of my grandmother, man. Like, I'm out here violating, right? But that thing around, they were clear about relationships.
Right.
They weren't concerned about control, because now you are asking, what you're able to assess what people are going through, right? So like Richard Wallace at Eat, when he says, look, when somebody told me I'm just trying to eat,
yeah,
it changes up how we understand not only the survival, but how we even rethink work.
Right.
So I think that thing around really being clear about that and not thinking about quote unquote solutions or ways to address the problem unilaterally,
right,
but to think about multiple approaches.
And we have to think about multiple approaches.
Exactly.
It's multiple problems.
Exactly.
And they're being concentrated in one area. But I really am thinking about that idea of relationships because there's so much of that in this book, even in the way that you're writing it. It's like, yeah, you have the charts, you got your diagrams and all of
No.
that, and your index. It does all the things the academic book does. But even the way you approach talking about some of the scholars in the book, you're like, I had a conversation with, right? And I think that's very important to couch it like that. I think we distance a lot of these ideas into these political silos, or we're thinking about it like, let me write it in this book that, people who are probably struggling with it may never read,
Right.
you know? So it's like, okay, maybe if we realize some of these things are conversations where we're really getting together to talk, to build a
Mhm.
relationship, we'd look at it differently. We wouldn't
Mhm.
be intimidated by it,
Right.
right? And I think that's a huge part of the conversation. But also, too, even when I talk to my students, I'm like, okay, how do you really listen to somebody?
Mm.
And they're like, oh, you do this, you do. I'm like, no, what do you do when you really listen? Do you act differently?
Mm.
Do you try to be mindful of certain cues, how they present to you? Do you ask questions? Do you validate and affirm? Do you be like, yeah, that's what's up?
Mm.
Something. You have to do certain things that that person understands so that they feel like they can open up.
Mhm.
And I mean, honestly, most of the stuff we see that is systemic, that's a problem, it's clear no one is listening,
Mhm.
right? In fact, they'd rather not.
Exactly.
So I think maybe that's why I was kind of thinking about the solution thing from the
Mhm.
jump is
Mhm.
like, okay, if the policies are definitely a counter to listening at all,
Mhm.
then where do we go from here? And you do kind of talk about that in the book. I love that when you get into talking with Eat and Let Us Breathe and Ujima Medics, because those folks were listening, thinking about, and not just listening, but improvising things that were relevant to the communities that they were working with.
Mhm.
Like I kept thinking about Ujima Medics, and when they were like, yeah, I don't have everything that's in a first aid kit. What could I use as a substitute? Right. And I was like, yeah, if you had stuff in your baby bag, what's in your baby bag that you could use, or something like that. So I think it's also about resourcefulness
Mhm.
as I'm reading this book. Like, how do people create a way out of no way,
Mhm.
or, create something underneath the institutions that kind of
Mhm.
flank us? Like you were talking
Right.
about undercommons in the
Right.
book briefly,
Right. Yeah.
which, I think that's what that book is really
What about?
about.
Yeah, because it's like, when you read the undercommons, and I've had chances to talk to Fred Monan, Stephen O'Harney in a couple
Yeah.
of spaces, and I feel like they write in this code. It's
Mm-hmm.
like it's scramble, 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 and then this thing is super clear. Your
Right.
only relationship to the institution should be a criminal one. Damn, all right, word. Right? So you're like, oh, okay, cool, word.
Right.
Here's how it goes. All right. But I think around when we talk about that relationship, and when I was talking to Martine, she was just like, the first question that came, that how they were thinking about Ujima Medics, she said, well, look, what happens if someone is injured and the ambulance is not coming?
Right.
Right? It's a different approach. Like you're gonna approach that thing differently, because
Mm-hmm.
they were teaching folks not just how to shore up a wound, but they were showing folks how to stabilize somebody and
Right.
transport them. Right. So this thing around really thinking about that fugitive space and saying, all right, ain't nobody coming, but we're here.
Mm-hmm.
So it's best for us not to wait, but now move in this particular way. And it was really interesting because she had on her original team, and now he's a board member, they had a retired firefighter.
Okay.
And he would always say, you always have to think about stabilization, because the stabilization, if you get that right, there's the greater chance that someone lives if you are transporting them.
Exactly.
Right. And he was breaking this down for folks. So folks think about it, they started in somebody's house. Right. So this thing around thinking about these particular possibilities and now activating them. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Let Us Breathe responded from a call from Palestine to bring gas masks to Ferguson, Missouri.
Yes.
Right. So Christian and Damon was like, well, look, let's get gas masks, right? And we're
Mm-hmm.
going to take them to Ferguson, right? And
Yeah.
then they started to say, well, what does it mean to be able to do this where we're from because we know people need it,
Right.
right? And that whole thing around, I remember I went to a session with Eat, and they were thinking about it. Now, people refer to it as the underground economy,
Mm-hmm.
but it's an economy, right? It's the
Right.
distribution of goods and resources because people need them.
Mm-hmm.
And now, when you think about it in that way, how do people start to do that work themselves, right?
Yes.
And can we, and all three of those organizations believe in sharing the information so people can do it for themselves,
Right.
right? So it's different than your seed exchange, but
Mm-hmm.
really saying, all right, if you're gonna grow something, look, what are you thinking about growing? What's the level of the soil in your space?
Right.
Here's what you can actually do. So thinking about it in ways that not only challenge our thinking, but are deeply intentional about meeting real life needs.
Exactly.
And when you do that type of work, you're forced, and I think this is one thing I probably didn't write about it as well, but everybody talked about it, is accepting mistakes over failure,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this thing around, so it's not a failure, right? That something didn't go right, right? There was something that didn't go right, and we had to figure out, reflect, now do something and figure out what did we need to do differently,
Right.
right? And not to be demeaning or uh, prosecutorial of ourselves, right? But
Yeah.
to say, nah, it ain't work. Okay, we got to move around and figure it out, right? It's the good friend of mine calls it the third grade equation, right? 8-year-olds are just gonna be like, all right, it ain't work. Okay, what we doing next? Like that's like, and it's not even, they don't even
But you
like
know,
stop. They like, look, what we on, right?
but I think that's, I mean, other than I want to always go, because my mother always had a Bible story for me, and she would be like, give a man a fish he eats for a day, teach him
Right.
how to fish he eats for life. But the counter to that is that they're creating these kind of models that, yeah, it could be a nonprofit, but it's spitting in the face of what the nonprofit industrial complex is, right? That, and I think mutual aid in some ways is doing that,
Mm-hmm.
that it's like, look, you had to jump through all these hoops, and people like Dean Spade are talking about help should not be conditional, right? And I think that's really important, especially now that one, people can see they can do it,
Mm-hmm.
that help should never be conditional, and that it doesn't have to be through these formalized structures that can sometimes be very judgmental and very oppressive in their own
Mm-hmm.
way,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, and that thing around, what one of my friends always talks about equity as getting people what they need because they need it,
Right.
right? And so when you think about equity with that frame, then you say, all right, I got it. And, it's an age old adage, right? My uncles used to tell my mom this all the time. So my mom is the ninth of nine and the only girl.
Oh,
And
wow.
they would always say, don't even worry about it, sis. I got it. You got it because I got it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it wasn't even an exchange. Like, look, what do you need? Okay, look, say, and this is before the young folks would say less, right? They just like, look,
Right.
I got,
It's done.
right, you got it. Look, you got it because I got it. Like, don't even worry about that. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that thing around pushing back on not only the nonprofit industrial complex, but this idea that this place outside of us will now have our liberation in it,
Which we know it
right?
doesn't.
And we always know that that's not the case, right? So
Right.
that undercommons or that fugitive space is saying, look, we know that if we deal with certain folks, there's the greater chance that they will exploit us before
Mm-hmm.
they will do right by us,
Right.
right? So that thing around really being intentional about, like in the book, The Preservation of Affordable Housing, they
Mm-hmm.
came, it's a group from Boston, right? And they came to Woodlawn Gardens, at that time was Grove Park Place. When they got torn down, people were like, okay, who are these folks? And they got slick names for the buildings. And they said, well,
Yeah.
what is this, right? And one of the directors of POA said, we had to confront that, right? We had to deal with that as a internal space.
Right.
And now POA has some footprint, but now it's this other thing that's rising up in East Woodlawn. Like me and my partner Irene, we were cracking this joke. So we get an email announcement.
Okay.
Fools be getting emails just random, right? Like, I know I did not give my email to these folks, right?
Yeah.
But we get placards in the mailbox once or twice a week.
Okay.
So it's a building. It was advertising. This one particular one we thought about. I was like, man, they advertising the building, and I had to think, and for folks online, I was like, damn, what does a 12-foot island even look like? I was like, damn,
that's tall as hell.
Like a 12-foot island. I was just like, this thing stretches 12 feet across, and they had the picture. You walk in the door. They do the little, they do the little drone shot. And you got the. Well, I'm just like, man, that's a 12-foot island,
how much
man.
kitchen do you have?
Right, exactly. I'm like, damn, what is it? So it's like this big galley kitchen, and you go into the island, right? And I'm just like, what is this? And I'm saying to myself, now, 20 years ago, the average price of a home west of Cottage Grove in Woodlawn was $125,000.
Yeah.
That home was selling, and it was the listed price for $769. And you always get, in East and West Woodlawn now, multiple bids. So that house probably went for closer to $1 million.
Probably.
Right? And this is, and I'm saying to myself, like, wait, this was like, I can remember driving in Woodlawn in the 90s, and there were entire blocks that were raised.
Yeah.
Right?
I remember that.
Yeah, or boarded up, right? And you say to yourself, like, okay, what's the thing? But it's the age-old adage, right? You close to the lake, you close to major thoroughfares, you got Lakeshore Drive, now you got the whack-ass Obama Center, and the whole thing, right? And then people are framed that as progress, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember there was a sign. I used to go running at the track on 64th, 62nd, and it was a sign in one of the buildings that said, "We believe President Obama." And I'm just looking like, shit, I don't. But this thing around really kind of putting that into context in terms of these things, and the Obama Foundation refusing a very straightforward community benefits agreement.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, there was nothing in that community benefits agreement that was overreaching, that was quote unquote asking for too much. It was literally saying, okay, don't gentrify us out. Make sure that folks have a place to live. Do not raise the property taxes in a space where elders can no longer afford the house. Mm-hmm. Make sure you hire folks from the community. Make sure you have an accessible library in that space.
In fact, hire librarians too, right?
Hire librarians to make the space a Chicago public library, mm-hmm. right? So now you have all the spaces. It's super simple, right? To the point where my parents were like, damn, like people ain't asking for a whole lot, but why is this just this abject refusal? And Obama's response, and I was just like, man, come on.
Yeah, it was disappointing.
Man, just saying, well, if someone asks for it's like, man, look, if somebody asks for a community benefits agreement after you've already created one, mm-hmm. all you say is, we have one in place. That's not a problem. We say, well, then I have to get one for them. And
I have to capitulate to everybody.
You don't, man. And that to me was just like, it's like, man, come on. Like,
that was a spit in the face. I did not like it.
And it's just disrespectful. And it's not to hate on Obama, but it's to say, man, look, there are things that are simple that you can do to be responsible.
Right.
And then they came up with and shout to Jeanette Taylor for really standing in the front of this, mm-hmm. because they created an ordinance. They said, okay, if you're 65 or older, the property taxes on your house will be frozen, mm-hmm. right? So you won't pay over this particular amount. but you can't pass off that benefit if you pass away.
Mm.
So it's only to the person, right? So the property won't keep the tax benefit, right? Now,
Wow.
now this is the thing. So my best friend is a chef in Chicago. This is kind of a weird thing in Chicago. If there is a liquor license in a building, if the building is demolished, it still keeps the liquor license.
But you can't let people keep a tax benefit.
But you can't let people keep a tax benefit. So you got this old rule that comes out of the end of Prohibition that allows anybody to keep a liquor license
Right.
through whatever. And now you can't pass over the issues and concerns to people who know that if they pass away, then this won't work for their family members. I mean, like all of that just
Right.
becomes.
It seems like a quick way to be like, okay, as soon as they're gone, we're gonna come in and swoop on it, you know? And we've been seeing that with all the tax stuff that's been happening. Like the fact that real estate taxes went up through the roof on the south and west sides of the city. It's a similar ploy, right? But I'm also thinking about one of the things you didn't mention about the agreement was that the schools that are surrounding the Obama Center are still predominantly black.
Mhm.
And they're not the ones people in Hyde Park talk about where they send their kids.
Right.
Their kids go to Kenwood,
Yep.
they go to Ancona,
Yep.
you know, and they'll be like, oh, where's your kid go to school
Yeah.
at? You know, and it was all these different schools. Like, and then just the fact that most of them have been consolidated or moved or closed temporarily, like all of these things that cause you were quoting Eve talking about that idea of institutional mourning,
Mhm.
which I'm like, dude, that's not hard to understand if you're an educator. You know, kids are going to act up if they have a sub. Kids are going to act up if the weather changes. Kids are going to act like any minor change in an educational environment is going to make your kids be like, time to get buck. So if you're moving kids to another building, sometimes where they have rivalry with other kids or competition with other kids, what's going to happen?
I mean,
Like that feels very intentional and engineered as well.
I kept and this predates the 2013 spring closings, right? So that's the largest set of spring closings in the history of the country. But in like 2005, I remember when Austin got closed in the Austin neighborhood, right? And the place that they sent folks to was Roberto Clemente.
Wow.
Right? And I'm saying to myself, in a hyper-segregated city, you are going to rationalize sending young people 7 miles away to another space where they are not known and not expect conflict. I mean, to the point where I'm talking to folks in Clemente at the time, they had a rule in Clemente in the lunchroom where you could not have a security guard less than 30 feet away from each other.
Wow.
Right? In the lunchroom. So I'm saying to myself, all right, well, I know where they do that. Yeah, right? So this thing around, I mean, places where you and I have worked, right, as part of the carceral state, right? Yeah. So this thing around, and just think about a young person, like, and to your point, a young person is saying, all right, y'all got me like I'm inside. I'm going to show you what it's like. I'm going to show you what this thing is, right? So now you have already stoked that type of response. And people say, well, that's the thing around the inherently evil young person that people want to put forward.
And I'm like, no, that's like, not it.
A 40-year-old in that situation is going to be like, man, hell no. Like somebody about to get it, right? Like what? And you think about doing that time and again. And ironically, you had 2 schools that were closer than Clemente.
Right.
That had enough spaces because Austin had been decimated. Like Austin at the time of its first closure maybe had 200 students. Right. So you could have sent those students, ironically, to Taft. Right? Now, Taft is this interesting thing in Chicago. Taft is the whitest non-selective enrollment high school in the city. It's always been that way. Right? But Taft was like, no. Right? And
we know they weren't going to OPRF.
Well, of course not, right? Because you're not crossing that boundary. That's 3 blocks away. right? So
Exactly.
this thing around, so I kept saying to myself, well, I refuse to believe that no one in central office said, you might want to rethink this,
Hmm.
right? And then that process of saying, okay, but who are these young folks,
Hmm.
right? You are taking a group of disinvested black folks, black youth, putting them in with a set of disinvested Puerto Rican youth, right? And now
Hmm.
the expectation is that everything is supposed to be good just
Yeah.
because they are welcoming folks and not thinking about the disinvestment that Roberto Clemente has
Hmm.
also experienced. So
Right.
now I'm saying to myself, like, look, man, this, when we look at this, and I always use this example with my students, I always ask my students, have you ever been in a fight that was so wild that you don't even know who you're fighting?
Mm.
Right. And for me, it's always just like, think about doing that one over 100 times in a 12-year period.
Hmm.
Right? What does that do to young folks? Right. And what is your state of wellness if you have, so if you think about the destruction of the State Street corridor and the Robert Taylor homes,
Okay.
you had young people for 4 consecutive years who just kept moving down State Street every year in terms of new schools, right?
Mm.
Hardigan, Carnegie, oh, Amos Coleman, Crispus Attucks, Farron, and Height, right?
Yeah.
Literally, just literally, you can like,
Boop,
and
boop, boop, boop.
and
Just
Pauline
kept
Littman
moving.
actually years ago documented this. They're literally going down the street, right? So what is that?
Hmm.
And as they're going down the street, the schools also depopulate, right? And
Hmm.
now where Hardigan used to be, there's now Bronzeville Classical,
Hmm.
right? So you go to 3 o'clock on 35th and State, instead of families walking to pick young folks up, you got every luxury car ever imagined, right? Picking up young
So
folks. And
crazy.
again, no acrimony to the folks who are going there, but we now have to think about who has been removed and replaced for this to
Exactly.
happen, right? And we always have to put that in the broader conversation.
Hmm.
And that's, again, back to your earlier point around words. So I don't take disposability lightly,
No.
like, because if someone has been rendered disposable,
Hmm.
that means that you have literally signed off on their elimination.
Yeah.
And however it comes, right? It could be elimination by gentrification, it could be elimination by displacement, it can be elimination by violence,
Right.
right? And now when you think about that, you say to yourself, like, here's the thing, and it's, the data doesn't lie, right? Where Chicago has lost almost 350,000 black people since 1980,
Hmm.
right? So now you ask those questions. I remember cracking a joke with my father, just being like, he's like, oh yeah, man, Uptown used to have a ton of black people. I was like,
Yeah.
what?
It did.
Right? He was
Fred
like,
Hampton did all kinds of organizing in this
with
neighborhood.
the Young
Yeah.
Patriots, everybody, right?
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah, man, we used to go, like, a couple of homies lived in Uptown. And I was like,
Right.
what? Right? But that thing around how you even think about that. I had a good friend in high school and many of you all may know this spot, but right off the corner of Halston and Armitage,
Hmm.
there's a historical black church, and the street is Coleman.
Yeah.
That street was all black families from Mississippi,
Hmm.
and they bought that church. So it's wild, like, you got all the Cubs stuff happening
Hmm.
on Halston and Armitage, and then you got this smattering of black families still going to that church,
Right.
right? And now all of the houses on Coleman are $1 million plus, right? But folks still have been able to claim space in that church.
Hmm.
So for me, it's always like that disposability, that piece of rendering someone disposable is always what we are contesting.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important thread that comes out through the book, but I also feel like it's really interesting. You can't dispose of completely of a city that was founded by a black man. You can't dispose of the fact that the oldest house in the city was saved by a black church. And nobody talks about that. It's on the DCASE website. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's, is it Ford House
Mm-hmm.
is the name of it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it was like, yeah, I go and I look and they preserved it to the time period. And I was like, okay, who did this? And then when I'm digging a little deeper, I'm like, oh, it was black folks. It was a whole church that put
Mm-hmm.
money into it, kept it. And now, the city talks about it and it's kind of like, here's this landmark. And I was like, we need to do something there. Why don't we do poetry on the steps? Everybody looked at me like I was crazy. Like, what? You want to do that? I'm like, yes, because we've always had a home here.
Mm-hmm.
If you want it to be your home, why wouldn't you be sharing it this way, where we
Yeah.
get together and we commune,
All right.
you know? But I think I think the thing that did give me hope though, in spite of all these things that seem so massive and so institutionally embedded, is that when you close out that last chapter, you're really talking about what are the things we can do, because we have to, and not even just what can we do, but what can we remember,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the memory is the thing that makes you go, damn, we have a blueprint for revolutionary things in this city
Mm-hmm.
every day, you know, whether it's Saul Alinsky or Fred Hampton, or we think about all the countless organizations that have come and gone. There's so many things that we can look to as a blueprint and a divergence,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think that thing around you have to dig for possibility, and I say this as a a re- a person who is now in their 50s started to revisit their anger, right?
we were
Because
angry, weren't
with
we?
yeah, man, look, because that whole thing. If folks would have known me 30 years ago, I might have been in Haymarket House. What the fuck? What the
Why we
shit?
here? Why
Like
we
that might
here?
have been like every word. What the fuck? What? Right? That was literally how I would respond to everything, right? And these young folks at this time were in the Black Youth Project 100,
Right.
and they said, Stovall, you need to think about operating from a place of love.
Yeah.
And I was like, what do you mean? This struggle, like, the fuck? Like we out here, like,
But
do you see this shit is war, right? Like, and that, but that
ah,
type of response, right? Because what it's allowed me to think about and do, and ask myself this very difficult question for me:
okay.
what is an overcommitment to joy in perilous times?
Mm,
Right. So that thing around really being like asking yourself that question, right? I'm looking at Bill and Bernadine and Viv Tan
yay.
and Liab Moshe and Dean Adams, and I'm like, and Dean and Liat, y'all didn't know me at this phase, but Bill and Bernadine and Viv, they knew me, and yourself,
Yeah.
y'all knew me at this phase. We was just like what? Like if I gotta go, I gotta go. It's that thing, and I remember,
The blood pressure's not worth it, friend.
man, and I remember I was told by someone, it is very easy to die for the struggle.
hmm
It is much more challenging to live for it.
Yes, it
Right?
is.
So that thing around really being very intentional about that. And I think that claim to joy, the claim to love in this moment now allows you to see possibility, right? So for
Right.
me, with all the fucked upness of the ice raids or what have you, I think about somebody like Rogers Park Ice Watch,
Yeah.
right?
They've been
They've been around
very
for
on it,
they was like, look,
baby.
we've been doing this, right? So
hmm
they've been disseminating information or what have you. Or I think about during COVID lockdown, just all the people who were just mobilizing their blocks around mutual aid. What do
Right.
you need? Let's figure out what folks need. Let's get it to them.
hmm
And that to me is always the support and the necessity of thinking about what is that overcommitment to joy, right? You
Right.
don't laugh to spite people,
Mm-hmm.
right? You laugh because if you don't, something even more tragic might happen,
Yeah.
right? And I say that as a, in writing it and then even trying to live that, it's a harder piece because I'm still in my, for people who know golden era hip hop, many times I think I'm in my MOP stage. And people who don't know who MOP is a group. MOP stands for Mash Out Posse.
Yeah.
And they used to have
And
this song,
mad aggressive.
man, super aggro, right? And they had a song called Annie Up, right? And
Oh my God.
it was
Check
like,
that
Annie,
fool.
check that fool, kidnap that fool, come up. And I was like, yeah, like I used to think about faculty meetings like Annie Up, like it's like, hell yeah. Hell yeah. Like this, like
So that was your song.
and
Because
I
I know
was
what my song was.
right.
Mine was Punk Step Up to
You
Get
beat
Beat
down,
Down.
especially with the dot verse, right? One day when I was walking, all of that. But that whole thing around now, what does it mean to still have that commitment, right? So there's a singer by the name, a British singer by the name of Poppy Ajuda.
Okay.
She has a song called Black Feeling, Black Love, Black Resistance.
Okay.
And she says, no matter what the oppressor will do, we will still be here. And I have to remind myself of that. And that is, again, it was difficult to write because I even felt myself like some of you all here would be with me in writing sessions, yourself included, right? And I'm
Yeah.
writing, and I'm heating up, and I have to go like, all right, you know what? That's not going to do right by me or the folks that I care about,
Right.
right? And that thing around really being that intentional, and if I'm that intentional, then there is the chance to engage in something that is hopeful is much greater.
Yeah. And I always think about if, well, one, I've been teaching bell hooks lately. Um, and it's so funny to me to think that All About Love is the one book I can't find in the public library now. Like
Mm,
there's at least 100 or so copies in the Chicago public library system. They're all checked out. So I
mm,
can't tell my students go check it out if they're
yeah.
on a budget,
Right,
right?
right.
Um, but when we talk about it, one of the things that they often overlook in the introduction, and I always go back to it before we talk about love is a choice, love is trust, commitment, respect, and honesty, and all these other things. I'm like, did you guys see the part where she talks about the mural she went to go see every day walking to work? And they're like, no, what did she say? I said, she said, I think it said hope or love on it, something
Mm-hmm.
really just like basic. And she said it was like one of those things that just gave her sustenance to go through the day. And then one day she came out walking to work and it had been whitewashed.
Mm,
Come to find out, there were people doing construction in the area, had painted over it, um, because it was basically a memorial to people who had passed from AIDS, HIV.
mm,
Particularly, the artist was
mm-hmm,
LGBTQ.
mm-hmm,
Um, and she was like, she went and found the artist and talked to them. That's how she found out
mm-hmm,
what was going on. But she's like, why don't we have a commitment to love? Because if we do, then we start thinking about how we could love everyone or
mm,
love people who aren't in our immediate circle. What would that
mm-hmm,
look like? What tangible actions
mm-hmm,
are that?
mm-hmm,
You know? And then I show them the piece by the pile of candy. Has everybody seen this art installation that looks like it's really beautiful, brightly wrapped candy? And it was a memorial to, I think the artist's first name is Felix. I don't want to torture their last name. Um, but it was a memorial they did for their partner who had
mm-hmm,
died to HIV and AIDS. And I said, I want you to think about art as a parallel to that. We sometimes create these things, they may not make sense to anybody else, but they
mm-hmm.
make sense to us,
Yep.
right? But it's also something to make us remember
Mm-hmm,
that love is important. We need to remember why we make things the way we make them,
mm-hmm,
right? And I think what you're doing here is such a testament to that.
Mm.
So thank you, friend.
No, I appreciate it, man, and thank y'all for folks who are listening online and for folks who
Yeah.
came out on this horrifically cold night.
And it's supposed to get colder, so get your hot drinks and everything and go in the house.
Right. Do not
Plasticize the
with those.
windows.
Right. Do not venture outside tomorrow if you will. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And
but did you want to see if anybody had
yeah,
questions?
surely.
Because we'll sit here and we'll mess around.
Right. It'll be time to go. They turning off lights.
We've known each other too well.
Right.
Did anybody have questions? Or are there questions online? I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
First of all, thank you. We always try to catch you whenever you talk. And I was talking about love. I feel like as Black people, especially foundational Black Americans, we're always loving everybody, but we don't love us. And so, can you speak to being able to tell the allies, hey, look, we've been loving you, so now it's time for you to start.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that becomes, and going back to bell hooks, right? It's around making that space for folks, right? White allies who understand the work, and I always think about John Brown, right? John Brown was like, look, I know that there are other struggles in different parts of this planet against this thing. I want to make sure that they have not only support, but that I am in unison with them, right? To the point where white America called him crazy, right? And I think that type of commitment is saying, well, what does it mean to get your John Brown on, right? Study John Brown, right? Study the folks who were part of SNCC, who, when Carmichael called for Black Power, said, he's right. Right. And that's a different conversation. Right. And I think that thing around always having that space and getting folks when they are trying to impose or exploit, right? And saying, no, we can't do that. I don't need to be your spokesperson in front of 200 donors to try to look. Now I'm giving you this pity story, right? I remember a good friend of mine said, he said, man, when I got out from incarceration, I just became a professional, formerly incarcerated person, right? So this thing around how do we get out of those spaces and now say, wait, love requires you to give space and to be responsible. So love requires a check-in, right? And if those things are not, if they hit a little harder, it's okay, right? But know that they come from a space where people have not had or been afforded the time to be with each other. Right. And I quote a organizer, always quote this organizer named G2 Brown, who always says, the one thing that white supremacy does is to eliminate spaces where Black folks can be together on their own terms.
That part.
Right. And I think that when you understand that, you move differently. Right. So what does it mean to be in support, but not to impose? And I think always when you have that particular conversation, you're better for it. And if folks are lost in that struggle, then that may have meant to happen, right? Who are the folks who show up with that understanding, right? And then those are the folks that we continue to build with.
And I think not just even moving in unison, but realizing that every group needs to have safe space. Now, does that group move in a way that's toxic, like a white supremacist group, or does it move in a way that's actually like, look, we're just affirming that people need to have space to heal, to grow, to recognize their humanity, to affirm each other, like that kind of thing. And I keep thinking, you got me kind of thinking about Bell Hooks' Salvation too, for that very reason. That's her one book in the Love trilogy dedicated just to Black people. And I love that she's talking about everything can't be bought. Like some of those things, the community that you have, the things that you do to save each other, you know, some yeah, you could pay somebody to do it, but it's also a thing of you could be like, this person did it and that meant the world to me in that particular moment in time, right? And how do we show up for each other? You know, it's a process of decolonization because they've made us say we got to buy everything from everybody. We got to be with these people. We got to live with these people, dress with these people. I'm like, no, you don't. Not
No.
for every single thing in your life. They don't do it with us, you know, and I don't mean it in a separatist way, but I mean it in the sense that
No, but I
we
mean,
walk through life in our community as individuals and with the people who are consistently there.
Mm.
and I might just say this real quick.
Mhm.
It's like, you know, there's been a lot of like,
Mm-hmm.
you
Right.
know, and the allies were, where's our black up?
Mm-hmm.
You know, where's the black up?
Mm-hmm.
You know, how come that, you know, where's our black up? We're
Mhm.
radio and we don't see you here.
Right.
It's like, look,
Right.
we're, you know, I'm speaking to me as an individual. I'm tired.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and
I
that's
show
real
up for you
too.
all the time and you don't show up.
Right.
Mhm.
And I
And
think
if you do show up for me, you're telling me how to behave, how to act,
right.
what sign to carry, what to say.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And
No.
that thing, that's where we have to embrace our refusal.
Mhm.
Right. And so what does it mean? What does it mean to embrace refusal? Right.
Mhm.
Like, no, I'm not saying this prepared remark. No, I'm not carrying 3 rows of 3. No.
Mhm.
No. And I think when you make that determination, there are some who will be dismissive of you as problematic. Fuck that. It's really around saying, look, what are we trying to do? And like, I always think about, I used to work with a teacher, good friend named Kamal LaRaviere. And I'm glad you mentioned King Day. He would always say, look, man, so he taught 7th through 12th grade. One year, we was just chopping it up at the house, and he was like, look, man, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm only going to teach King's last 3 years of life.
Mm.
Right? He said it. So I'm a flip it completely. He's like, I'm gonna teach the last 3 years, and so he's giving 7th graders beyond Vietnam. Where do we go from here? Right? Poor People's Campaign. Right? He's giving these 7th graders this, and then they go 7th graders. One of them was just like, man, look, this was like, Mr. Ravi, we got a plan. Right? And he was like, okay, y'all, what's the plan? He said, look, my uncle got a van.
Uh-oh.
He got a van with it. He said he got a van with a speaker on top. So, 7th grade ingenuity. He was like, look, we're going to drive around the block and we're going to play Beyond Vietnam.
Baby.
Right? And I was just like, damn, right? So he was like, thinking 7th graders in the car like, yo, y'all hearing this? But I mean, but that thing around, and it was always, and I feel like Kamal wrote about it a little bit. He said, like one of his kids was like, man, Mr. Lavier, King was a G, but we never give him credit for it.
We do not.
Right? Because we've sanitized him. He was like, man, until I came to your class, all I got was August of 63. Right? So now when you talk about, okay, well, let's really bring into question why he was possibly killed. Right? And that's a different, and now people even think about that as insidious. Right? As you are inciting something, in opposed to saying, well, we're redirecting things. And how do we, and the folks that I talk about in the book, they have committed to redirecting things because the world now has become a place that constantly reminds them of their disposability.
Right.
Right? What is the breakage of that? Right? And how are people being very intentional about the breakage? And that is, or the ruptures, because that's the thing that gets us into a different conversation, right? I remember a group of doctors found out about Ujima medics, and they were like, man, can we go to the workshops? Blah, 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 blah. We want to get it. My team was like, hold on. Right? It's cool. We appreciate you. But you just can't be coming in here running roughshod, right? And there was one person who was like, okay, that's what it should be, right? And just said, let me know what you need, right? And that's a very different approach than coming to the space and now trying to take over. No, let me know what you need.
Yeah, it's like Leela Watson quote.
Yeah, and that's I think those types of things are now, we're in a moment where we're seeing those things kind of rise up. Where folks are like, look, it is clear about our disposability, right? And if we did not think it now, before, we know it now.
Right.
And now here's what we're gonna do. But I think that space around, again, the overcommitment, right? And something, again, man, I tell y'all, man, I struggle with that, right? And that and writing about it, how people thought about it was a relief in some ways, because they were talking about how it's an unfettered commitment,
right?
And we will do it just because we can, right? I think that's a different take.
Yeah, and just because you said the part about being tired, I think rest is a part of that too. And I'm so glad that's become part of the public conversation, because I know one of the things we talked about for years was like, we never do enough. We got to keep working. It's the work, it's the work, it's the work, right? And I think for a lot of people on the margins, a lot of Black folks, a lot of women, a lot of people of color, it's like, damn, okay, so when we're burnt out and then the system is doing the things that it's doing right now, where it grinds down even harder, it's like, it's relentless. And if you're not taking care of yourself, that's not self-love, right? There is a point where there has to be some self-preservation. You need to rest, baby. Please do it. Because then you have a chance to be here longer to do something when you feel you're ready, And I think that ties into the book. I feel like some of these people are making space that you're talking about in these orgs, to make that space for people to be like, okay, I can at least catch a beat. Because I feel like, and I'm sure other people are feeling like this right now. You go to sleep at night and you're like, okay, we made it through today. And then you check your phone or you turn on NPR or something and you're like, damn, this again?
Right.
Again?
And then the
like,
little,
it's just not a break.
And then the little things, the smallest things set you off, right? So RFK Jr. goes into this thing about putting saturated fat back into the food pyramid. I was like, man, what the fuck? Like, come on! Like, I'm literally around the corner, about to meet one of the homies for breakfast, and I'm like, what? And like, so I go into the restaurant. I'm like, man, can you what? What is happening right now, right? And that thing around, but I got scooped into that distraction, right? I got scooped into that thing to dislodge me, right? Just like what I try to write about in the book. Like, many of you all have had these experiences where you're familiar with a building, and when you see it razed, torn down, you either remember it or you become numb to it. And I remember that, like, over the last 25 years in Chicago, like, just being in certain places, just being like, damn, I remember what used to be here. And then me and some of my friends saying, but did it used to be here or did it used to be here?
Yeah, it's like spatially it moves in your mind.
Yeah, and you're looking at it, and one of the places that always gets me is Milwaukee Avenue between Ashland and Dana.
Ooh, baby.
Right? So we used to be over there, as my uncles would say, right?
I used to walk there. Young Chicago authors used to be there.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So we used to be over there, right? And you remember all the spaces, and now you're looking and it's like Yeti. and then like Bank of America. You're like, damn, man, it's like $300 backpacks for real.
But that's surreal.
But that whole thing around what it does to you, right, in terms of how you think about it. I used to live on 73rd and Ridgeland. And I remember I saw a white family sunbathing on 73rd and Stony Island. And I was like, oh, shit, what? And one of my guys who always has this kind of sarcasm, he was like, well, Stovall, you got new neighbors. And I was like, damn. Like, it's a whole different thing, because the thing around it is always the comfort level.
Right.
Right. So, we talk about, Gentrification is not the Starbucks as much as it is the white jogger,
Yeah.
right? So when the white jogger comes, you're like, ooh, shit, right? Because the next thing is going to come is the jogger with the baby stroller. Then the next thing is the jogger, the baby stroller, and the dog,
Yeah.
right? And you just saying to yourself, like, damn, man, this is a whole different thing. And, you know, you just, my students used to be like, Stovall, when I see him, I just wave. I just sit on the porch and be like, hey, right?
But you know, and I think it's one of those tropes. If you grow up in a black neighborhood, you know,
right.
You're just like, then you get put on a, like, I remember living in Bed-Stuy,
Mm-hmm.
and we saw a white dude walking down the street with like a bag of golf clubs. And for a while, I was the whitest looking person in the neighborhood. I'm like, what the hell are you doing here? You know, because it was just so alien to everything else you saw. So you're like, okay, how long is it before I can't afford to live here anymore? And that's usually the next thought that comes up. Yeah.
I mean, like that, when you're engaging like that, I mean, I think this is one of the things I try to capture in the book, is saying you are in something and you have to step back to understand the intensity of what it is that you're in.
Right.
Because you're living it, you're experiencing it in certain ways, other ways you're numb to. And then you ask yourself, well, what's coming up in its place?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I would encourage folks to check out this one thing. And it's such an, I've been trying to get the history of this building. If you go to the Dearborn Homes, which is a Chicago Public Housing Authority unit,
Mm-hmm.
between 27th and like 29th and 26th in state. You get to about 26th, 27th, and there's this building in gold leaf. And it has this wave on it.
Mm.
And I'm like, and it's in the middle of the Dearborn Homes. And I was always looking at one day I just got out the car and just walked up to it. Like,
right.
What is this thing, right? It is a Chicago Park District field house that was designed by this very kind of high-end architect. But you have to be right up on it to notice it. And the first thing I thought about is, how are they marking time here?
Mm.
How are they marking space? And who is this for? Right? Because it's not away from the Dearborn Homes, it is in the middle of it, right? To where you have to kind of walk up on it to even notice it. So, you know, again, thinking about that in ways that now, one of my homegirls who still lives in the Dearborn Homes, she was just like, yeah, when they built it, everybody was like, what is this? Right? And that thing around what that does to you over time.
Mm-hmm. Makes me think. So, do we have time for any other questions, or how are we doing?
We have them from the folks.
Great. Yeah. Can you read one?
Yeah. So we're saying, with the most recent Cook County Board of Review tax increase impacting neighborhoods citywide, do you have any thoughts on how we can collectively respond to that? It seems like most advocacy groups are fatigued due to the cascading struggles happening throughout the state.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really becomes important, and this is really to figure out zoning in particular areas, because sometimes your alder person can do certain things with zoning that can limit the amount of new structures that come. And something also to pay attention to is whether or not you can mobilize a TIF. Now, this becomes important because TIFs have been used as essentially slush funds.
Right.
But what some communities have actually done is really kind of plot out how they can be used to influence the public good. Now, with that tax increase, I think another thing that comes up is really to get folks, I mean, I feel like there needs to be this education campaign around progressive taxes. or progressive taxing, because we don't talk about what progressive taxing could allow folks to do. And progressive taxing just really means taxing that's proportional to income and wealth, right? And we don't have a system like that. We have a system that kind of brackets people, and the bracket actually taxes folks at a higher rate who make less.
Yep.
Right. And I think that really becomes important around tax structures. And you've seen some interesting things that folks have done. So in the early 2000s in Seattle, they used it to build co-op affordable public housing. You see a couple of projects, ironically, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that actually moved in that way. And then another thing is taking into account the fatigue of folks, right? And now really thinking about, if folks are fatigued, then who are allies who may be able to move this in different ways. So I think that's really the kind of the power of organizing, in terms of, if we don't have capacity, who might have capacity? How can we keep in tune with those folks who have capacity? Because again, it's this barrage, right? You wake up every morning and you say to yourself, what? And you now have to figure out a way to kind of step back and say, okay, well, here's what's possible. And I think that barrage now can be reimagined if we think about progressive taxes, if we think about proportional taxes, if we think about zoning, but again, a multi-pronged effort, in opposed to something that was just kind of one spot shot, because that's always the thing about taxing, right? You're taxed differently for income than you are for property, right? You're taxed differently for income, property, and then even for the providing of infrastructure services, right? So all of these things are divvied up in all these different ways, and it sometimes feels like you need an actuary to figure out what actually is happening. But I think there are important spaces, and actually, let me give folks the name of somebody who kind of documents this. There's a guy named Ralph Matera, who's at the Illinois Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. And he does a really good job of documenting what the rationales were around property taxes, and then what are potential alternatives. And he's been doing that now for almost 30 years. But I think that's he's been a really good resource for folks to understand it. He puts in very straightforward language around what's happening. And that's really been useful for me, who is by no shape or form a math person.
Okay. Was there anything else? You're looking very studious. We have a great tech team here at Haymarket House, so I just want to thank them.
Shout to y'all for getting us popping online. Yeah. Or if there were any questions from folks
and if
here.
there's any questions here, you guys made it. So
man, for real.
you get the in-person shot.
Wrong. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
First of all, congratulations.
No, thank you so much.
Wonderful to see it, like, but it's kind of a general question that I think you probably, I mean, obviously the book just came out, so I haven't read it, but I mean, you grappled with it through, all your work, but how do you move people to understand engineered conflict as engineered? We started with the question about language, and we talked about structural violence. And I think for a lot of people, especially like today, they're really trying to understand, kind of like the structural. What they end up with is so-and-so, alderman, so just like the answer you just gave, right? Like they get lost in the sauce. But also, it's a way to kind of deflect from the structural, in the sense of people are always kind of like people, I mean, progressive, at least progressive, sometimes even radical, that get lost in the kind of like
Mm-hmm.
Follow the money, and I'm not saying that's not useful.
Right.
Like I'm coming from a perspective that it's incredibly useful, and you and other people like do that work. But also the gotcha thing, I think only gets you like so far.
Yep. Absolutely.
And yeah, so how do you? My question is, how do you do that in writing?
Mm-hmm.
Going back to common members.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One of the tools that I was trying to put forward is making that conversation of engineering palpable, right? So if engineering is about the elimination of human error, then where does the error occur, right? Who is thought to be an error, right? So to
Mm-hmm.
get us away from the gotcha moment, but to say, how are people positioned as errors, right? And
Mm-hmm.
more importantly, errors to what, right? So Atif Saeed asked me this question once when I was doing it in a workshop, when I was kind of talking about the early stages of the book in a workshop. And he said, engineered for whom?
Yeah.
Right. And I thought that that was just a nice way to kind of couch, right? If a city can make you fight, then it makes room for all the people that it's in agreement with to take those places that you once used to be. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think so that in writing, having that very simple conversation and then saying, well, where does that happen? And man, Leah, to your point, kind of a strange story about writing the book. So I was writing the book and it was like, all right, I got 5 chapters, blah, 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 blah. And then I said to myself, I'm like, damn, I got to write about where this thing happens, right? Because I wrote about schools separately, housing separately, law enforcement separately.
Mm-hmm.
But now I got to put I got to have a space where this happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I had to think about, well, what neighborhood to use better than my own,
Right.
right? So that way it allows people to kind of see this thing that we think to be so meta is actually right in front of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
To the point of literally looking at a for sale sign, right? So like on my block, I write this thing about there were 4 apartment complexes and 1 condo complex built on my street, literally my block, like 2 houses, the 2 apartment buildings away to the north, 3 buildings away to the south
Mm-hmm.
in a 20-month period. And I looked at, and I was saying to myself, like, man, just the rate. So I looked at what families, so there's a group of newer houses that were built in like 2015. They sold for like 170 grand. Those condos directly across the street were valued, which is this made up number, at $768,000. Right? So now when you look at that particular exchange and in everyday conversations, just kind of ask that question, well, what does that mean for folks' taxes?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because it's just gonna explode them, right? For folks who may have been, and I think about my own taxes, right? And I try to put a little bit of that. I think when I moved to Woodlawn in 2012, I think my taxes were maybe $1,500 a year, maybe. Now they're $8,000, right? So this thing around like really putting that in this broader conversation, right? So I think to get us away from the gotcha space is to say, what does this mean for folks in the day to day, right? In our everyday thing. So not something far away. So not like an interrogation of Sterling Bay, the developer that now got you buying $10 drinks, right? But that, I mean, like,
it's not 10 anymore.
right. It's ain't even that more. And it was actually from one of our colleagues who passed away. And it's, when I say it to people, they think it's kind of a trick statement, but it's actually a physical statement. So Janet Smith, who was an urban planner, passed away a couple years back. She would always say, she was like, well, Stovall, you got to understand what's happening in the West Loop. She said, the gentrifiers are gentrifying the gentrifiers. And she said, just look, because she and I were going back and forth about this one building. So it's a building on the corner of Morgan and Adams. And yeah, it's this beautiful building, right? This terrible monstrosity builds up, and you're just like, man, what is happening? And then that architectural firm that was down the street, super fresh building, the architects, and then they built this crazy monstrosity. And then I was saying to myself, well, the architect folks, and that was Janet's point, the architecture firm knew what it was. They was like, look, we built this building. Don't even worry about it. We will sell this thing for a landmine. So we can build 3 more buildings that we just put up, right? Yeah. And the thing, but again, this kind of flash boy, high rate, transnational, late stage capitalism would literally have folks destroy a new building to get payment to build another new building.
Yep.
So that thing, and many of us are familiar with the sale of Harpo Studios, right, which became the McDonald's headquarters, right? And that's, for everybody, that's not they always say that that's the US headquarters for McDonald's. No, that's the international headquarters for McDonald's, right? So everything around the world comes through there, right? Mm-hmm. So when you start to think about that, so what does this Flash Boy thing do over time? And now in writing about it in that kind of everyday space that allows folks to kind of see it, right? To kind of build out an image where they can just kind of look and go, oh, right? It's a different story here. I remember when I first saw the original Haymarket, I was like, oh, damn. Whoa, this is wow, right? But this thing, and my friends who are New Yorkers, right? So they have a place called the Meatpacking District, right? Or the walkway that I always mess up. But that thing around, who is allowed, and then in terms of the writing, pushing back to say, who is allowed to be here after these things have happened, mm-hmm. right? So that is one of the spaces how I try to get us away from it, because I feel you on that kind of gotcha moment, but really to really say, no, this stuff happens in real time, right. And all we got to do is kind of ask a very basic question before we kind of get into the weeds of subsidiaries and shadow corporations, right. or actual spaces that don't exist that now are used to hide money. So you don't even have to do that, but just to say, okay, if I look at this one plot of land, what's happened here, right? And I actually kind of stole that concept. Many of you all have seen this documentary called King Corn.
Oh God, yeah, a long time ago.
Yeah, King Corn is really interesting. These dudes, these filmmakers, they buy an acre of land in Iowa, and then they farm it, and then they look at all the things that and it's a way for them to understand corporate farming. But it's literally just 1 acre. It's just this one
teeny
square acre. And they're just like, yeah, we're going to farm. We're going to throw some corn up. Cool. They go to the market. Right. It's like, they go to the market. They sell it at the market. And these are filmmakers. They just like, look, we're going to do this thing. But it really allowed you to understand what farmers were doing. But it had a very basic conversation, right? It's a very simple plot of land. Here's what we try to do on it. And here are all the pressures that we got in. I think they maybe did like 2 planting seasons, mm-hmm. but all the things that they got into it, but trying to get that language, the descriptive language, but to bring it to a palpable level.
Yeah. I think the book does some really interesting things too, because it's doing that, right? It's breaking it down by, like I said, education, housing, policing, and the carceral state, but it's also looking at this historical timeline. And it made me start looking at it like, okay, if we think about history like a topographical map, and some things are stacked on top of each other, some things are going to be lower and higher. I don't mean to put it in a hierarchical sense, but the terrain is not going to be the same. It's not going to be level. So imagine we just keep putting new layers, new blankets, new things on top of it. Some are going to still be lower and they're still going to be higher, or it's not going to hold the same. And I feel like that's what the effect of the history is in this book. It's like you see that it's like whatever was decided before by all this stuff that happened in the past is coming to pass now in these ways that the terrain is going to be raggedy. It's not going to be smooth. And I think we need to think about that when we think about public policy, how these things interact with each other, how they're with each. And it's not always like this, like you said, it's not a super dense thing where we're looking to find all the shell corporations. It's really ingrained in the policies. And if we don't change that and we don't change how we remedy them individually, collectively, and through established government, then we got a lot to do.
Want to make
Yeah.
sure.
Go ahead.
I
hon.
just wanted to ask, I've just been thinking about like what to do because it's very enraging to learn, and then it's like things have happened, like the Civil Rights Act, and we have a little bit more money now in the Black community, but like in the bigger picture, like we are still in the same situation, and so like you go to the grassroots that are kind of like not that good anymore right now. It's just my opinion. I could be wrong. Or you go to the nonprofit route and they're like working with Blue Cross Blue Shield, and it's just like
Real talk, yeah.
I don't know what to do. And then when you go to school and like liberal arts colleges, that's all they talk about. And it's like, okay, so what do we do? Because I tried all of this, and I've seen a lot of problems, and I know everything has a limit, but like it just seems like we get to the limit, and then that's just it's like very stagnant. So then like the answer is, well, just do everything. Like everything.
Everything is not doable.
Right. That will kill you.
Yeah.
Right. That will kill you.
Right. You know what I mean? Like from the second we arrived, our ancestors arrived here, it's just been one thing after the other. So it's just I would like to know, because I feel like we need like one single system of trying to get free, because like when because and especially like we can't escape the conversation about economics and finances, even though I don't like talking about it, because it's like I feel like you turn into a capitalist when you talk about it. But like the reality is like, yeah, like we were denied home ownership, and like that would have helped us. So how do we like embrace? But at the same time, the system doesn't have a problem with billionaire Black people and like the elite, Black community. They have a problem with the consciousness.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, I'm just wondering like.
So there was a sister by the name of Carol Adams, and I was probably, and please forgive my boomer moment. All right, because I was about your age, and I asked her the same thing.
Yeah.
And what she told me was, you have to do one thing well so you understand how everything else works.
I heard that.
And at that time, her thing was, okay, if you think about whatever that issue is, that one thing, what is it connected to? How do we now start to think about those connections? Now, we may not be able to influence those connections, but the work actually changes how people interact with each other, right? It changes the relationship, because what you're doing is you're putting yourself in practice, right? And two things. Don't be afraid of failure, and never be afraid of leaving.
That's real.
And I think you have to be very clear about that, right? So now you're just building out your capacity, right? And it may not feel like the thing, right? So when I was 19, I used to do this work with this history project. And it was young folks doing a history, and I was an undergrad history major. I'm like, man, this is cracking, blah, 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 blah. The young folks were like, nope. And they were like, this is what we need to do. They said, we understand that we're being pressed by gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
Who do we build alliances with? Now, this is a group of 5th through 10th graders, right? But they had come to the space to say, no, all right, look, history project, we like that because it's cool because we can start to dig into things. But then they said, all right, as I dig into this thing, who are the people who know that story? And then 2, what are the possibilities in making sure that we have what it is that we need? And they actually, with their work, they saved the building from becoming demolished. Right? And that was a place, ironically, that Harold Washington started his first affordable housing campaign as mayor.
Wow.
It's a place called the Woodlake Community Homes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this thing around really being very clear about that, right? Because it does not happen all at once. It does not happen in ways that first feel gratifying, right? If we talk about struggle always requires reflection. That reflection will allow you to figure out direction. So anything you do, now, who are we reflecting with, right? And if it's not sounding right, why is it not sounding right? Right? And then who are we building community with, right? I'm a big fan of the statement, small is all, right? Because that's actually how you build mass movements, right? Something Bill and Bernadine always remind me, and a guy named James Anderson, he always says, well, look, he said, only 1% of Black people participated in what was not called the Black Freedom Movement.
Right.
Right? So this thing around really, so we think about it as these mass things. Nah, right? It was 1 out of every 350 people, right? So this thing around really putting that type of understanding in your work, right? It does not all come at the same time, but at the same time, if you are committed to it, now you can see if this thing has progressed or devolved. Right? We always have to be asking ourselves that question, right? And one of the things I put in the book, one of my guys he would always say this to me. And I was like, man, I gotta put that in the book. He would always say, housing is an education issue because education is a housing issue. It's like there's no way to separate those two things, right? And when we think like that, now we can start to see where these things are connected, right? And another last thing, do not engage this as a solo mission. Right? That's the easiest way to discourage you, right? In order to be in this work for the long haul, it requires us to build community with folks, right? No matter how small, but you need those folks who show up and now show up in particular ways that are supportive of you. Because now in this time of deep distraction, talk becomes explicitly cheaper.
It does.
So now, how do we think about who are the folks who show up, right? Because you can talk super slick, right? But who shows up, right? And those are the folks that you build out. And last thing, Kelly Hayes wrote this. She edited this book that I just think
that book.
that I
Oh my
think is
God.
just great in terms of how she understands struggle. She says, "Read this when everything else goes wrong."
They should have copies here.
Great, yeah, I think they might have a couple because what she does, she puts these real life situations in conversation. Right? She says, "Look, this is what happens when it just goes off a cliff." Right, and she got 12 chapters,
and it's each by different people.
Right?
But it's beautiful.
But what all of it is a reminder of. We got to think about the connection. We got to think about what sustains us and invigorates us, despite the pain, suffering, and degradation. Right.
Yeah.
And it's a tough piece because I remember I opened it up, some of y'all may have had this experience too. I opened it up and I closed it. I was like, shit, do I need
No, that book is real. I mean,
like, do I need to be
so many things.
But yeah,
Like,
it's important.
and I'm listening to you and I'm looking at you as a young Black woman, and I'm like, when I think about how so many times people just either assumed I was okay, assumed I didn't need any help, or just acted like I was invisible, like all that advice held true. And I just started paying attention. I said, who shows up? Who answers the phone when I call? Who answers my emails? And those would be the people that I would tend to gravitate towards, because you don't have time for it. Your life is too precious. This time is finite. And I always think of Mary Oliver and her poem where she says, and what will I do with this wild and precious life? And I'm like, I'm just trying to keep this flower upright for as long as I can. And that's what we are, right? This very frail and vulnerable body, you know? And I'm just like, you got to look at who do you want to stay in touch with? Who stays in touch with you? Are you doing the baseline health stuff? Even if you can't get to all the things you need, like try to do the best that you can with that. And like you said, being good at one thing. Like, I never thought I would be able to find a way to help poetry help me make a living, and I wasn't one of the ones where I got to, I did TV and stuff, but I didn't jump around enough. I wasn't loud enough. I wasn't performative enough. And I said, no, I'm going to go write these books. I'll go back to school. I'll go back and do the PhD. By the time I had my PhD, nobody wanted to hire a PhD in the English department, or they find me a reason why I couldn't be there, right? I'm like, you will find your place if you do the things that you're good at. And I hate to say it that way because it sounds hokey, but I'm teaching in peace studies. They just saw my resume and I guess because I did do things in the community, they were like, "Oh, we need you." I said, "Really?"
Right. I mean, I teach in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice because
Right.
I almost left, and Black Woman Magic in the Midnight Hour was like, "Hold on, homie, slow up." They was like, "Look, we need to talk to." And what they said to me, I will never forget. Barbara Ransby James Rhodes and Beth Ritchie said, "If it doesn't work out, it's on us."
Right.
Right. And I was just like, damn. Like that thing. They was like, "Look, we gonna ride regardless," right? But I would argue, they only showed up because I did similar and the same things for them. I am a firm believer in this. If you do the work that you were trying to do, the people you need will show up. The thing that we have to be clear about is, do we see them when they show up? Right?
That's why you got to pay attention.
I used to crack this joke with somebody who I thought was like super bougie, was like, wasn't really trying to rock with folks. Then I go into a schoolhouse and she there. I'm like, oh, shit, right? Stiletto heels, working with third graders. And I was like, what is going on right now? Right? But those third graders were rocking with her. Right? I did not say a word to her for the first 7 years of my employment at UIC. Right? Until we was in a schoolhouse. And she was like, yeah, it's she had a whole network of teachers that she was working with. And I was just like, damn, how did this happen? Right? But somebody who I would have never thought fit the mold was doing the work.
Yep. Right?
And that was a whole thing. And we still crack this joke. Like, she wears those same stiletto heels in weather like this.
She's
right.
Bad.
Yeah, she's a bad one, right? She just this dude. I was like, what are you like? But that thing around being able to be in those spaces, and now you see the folks who show up, right? And that is harder to see sometimes when you're struggling and battling with things, right? So now how do we slow ourselves down so we can see them?
And see that you're enough.
Absolutely.
Like, there's so many times, and I see this with my students and other people that I know and love, I'll be like, wait, what did you do today? and they'll tell me what they did. And I'm like, you do realize there are trifling people in this world who didn't do a quarter of that today. And they're very satisfied with their lives. And I'm not saying become one of those people. But what I'm saying is that we're usually, you know, if we're asking these kinds of questions, we're probably interdisciplinary already. We're probably multidisciplined because we read across all these genres. We already know Black women in America are the most well-read people. They've already done tons of studies and articles on that. Most agreed in terms of people on the margins. So why are we trying to prove something? You know, are we doing it really for us, or are we doing it to prove something to this external thing? And I'm like, no, I did it because I want it. And now you can't tell me nothing because you can't take the degree back, even if I still owe you money. But so,
Whoa.
but I don't know if there's any more questions. We might be getting close to time,
right?
and you guys have been so generous. I thought about you reading something from the book, and I almost was going to read something because you haven't read from it.
All right. Well, let's close this out. Like this is because this is, and I'll do this last.
Because they love to hear you talk.
This is.
I know I'll be checking YouTube. What's Dave talking about now?
Right. They. So I wrote this thing. The epilogue is about Mayor Johnson winning in 2023.
Cool.
Right? As the first progressive mayor in over 40 years, Johnson must make the decision to work in solidarity with people on the ground who are willing to resist corporate capitalist state power. It is uncommon for Chicago mayors to move in community with his residents, but the Johnson administration can pull lessons from the historical interruption of Mayor Harold Washington. His mayoral victory provides important instructions on what it means to center the needs of the marginalized and disenfranchised. Despite the perpetual racist opposition from members of city council, the Washington administration showed what is possible in turbulent times. Before Mayor Washington's untimely death in 1987, the administration fought for health care, education, and housing for communities on the margins, standing as tangible proof of possibility in a moment where justice work can appear to be more grueling by the second. Returning to my neighborhood of Woodlawn, the migrant shelter at the old Wadsworth School building that has housed over 200 Venezuelan migrants was vacated on May 13, 2024. All of its residents have been relocated to other parts of the city. While it is important to secure housing for migrant families displaced by economic collapse in their home country, the concern now is whether or not they will be placed into deeper precarity if they are moved into spaces where people are unfamiliar with them. The interracial tensions of engineered conflict have already ravaged the city for many of its Black neighborhoods. We must do the work to see that similar tensions do not rise again.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you, David.
Yeah. And thank y'all. Thank y'all again. And before we get out, I can sign some stuff.
Okay.
I guess.
All right.